So now we're going to hand over to our final speaker, Dr. Lisa Smith, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Essex, and she'll be talking, as you see here, about two silk workers.
Right, thank you so much to Gail and Pamela for inviting me to speak tonight. So this talk is based on an article that my colleague and friend Kathy McClive and I published earlier this year in French History. And our collaboration began when Kathy approached me to talk about some remedies she'd found in a wonderful cache of sources that she thought actually, it was a surprise that she had found them in the first place. They were things that you wouldn't expect to be in that particular archive. And she'd found them at the Rhone Departmental Archive in Lyon. There were several papers from the 1750s which had belonged to two women, Marie-Madeleine Grande and Marie Fiançon. In a letter to their patron, the Countess de Grollet, Grande confidently claimed medical expertise by signing the letter as both a herbalist and a chemist, or a chemist, as we might say. But she and Fiançon also worked as something called a dévideuse, or a silk unwinder, both before and during their 30-year-long medical work. So the case immediately piqued my curiosity. So the Healing Words exhibition, I think, does a really wonderful job of showing the interplay between the knowledge of learned medicine, specifically physicians, and that of domestic medicine, particularly that of gentlewomen. And the exhibition reflects the work of many wonderful scholars, such as Elaine Lyon, who's Finn's supervisor, and many others, who've carefully examined these manuscript recipe books that have been left behind by wealthy gentlewomen and their families. And they've looked at them for traces of medical knowledge, lived experience, and medical preparations. Now, recipe books have been preserved in Britain to a much greater extent than in France. In France, the French Revolution destroyed many old family archives, and they also have very political and legal-based cataloging practices that emphasize those categories rather than the domestic. So it's quite difficult there to find recipe books. Not impossible, but difficult. So the fact that the collection that Kathy drew my attention to had some recipes in it was particularly interesting. Now, we know very little about early modern women's medical work beyond elite families still, unless it's hospitals or midwifery. The everyday practices of urban healers, especially female ones, only tends to emerge when networks or relationships break down, or when their work clashed with medical corporations, such as Maggie Pelling's work on the Royal College of Physicians shows. Some historians of early modern London, Venice, and Rome have identified non-elite women with extensive medical practices, but often the details of that day-to-day work are a bit skimpy. This is what makes the case of Grande and Fiançon so interesting. Their records, which include letters, recipe books, and a herbal guide, allowed Kathy and I to reconstruct the medical activities of a successful practice. The details of their everyday work also suggest three things. First, that our understanding of domestic medicine has been skewed so far by our tendency to focus on gentlewomen, for good reason, because that's what we have ready access to. But we've tended to assume that those lower down the social scale had relatively limited access to books and equipment, which isn't necessarily the case. Another point that it suggests is that historians have tended to divide women's work into fixed categories, in which women either had a household or a family network that focused on medical practice, they were doing it perhaps as paid or charitable occupation, or they were people operating on the fringe of the medical world. What Kathy and I think, though, is that actually they were probably more at the center, and so this is what we were looking at with Grande and Fiançon. We also think that there's been relatively little consideration of the ways in which women's practices might exist alongside other occupations, in part because this isn't often visible in the records. For example, women's occupations aren't always listed in the records, unlike men's occupations, which makes it further hard to find them. So Grande and Fiançon treated a wide range of ailments for the wealthy, working and poor families of Lyon, as well as religious communities who lived within and beyond Lyon. Like many urban workers, their place of residence was in the center of town, and it was also the place of their business, so they did everything there. It was on the 4th floor of a multifamily building on the Rue de la Gerbe, which was a place that had been there since the Middle Ages. Now, unmarried women often lived together. This wasn't unusual for the two women to be living together. It cut down on domestic and work expenses, it allowed companionship, so there's a range of reasons why they might have done that. Within their household, they prepared medicines and cared for patients. They oversaw the collection of medicinal herbs, brokered wet nursing arrangements between rural women and Lyon hospitals, and established networks of patients both within and beyond the city. Their medical practice was an extension of their occupation as silk workers as well. This was a notoriously precarious role, especially for women. Female silk workers would have constantly looked for piecework. Although their work was highly skilled, their status and pay fell between the status of servants and day workers. Medical practice, especially women's, was also precarious and was often done as one of many occupations. Now, medical work was higher status than silk work, and it could draw on domestic and silk working tools that they already had to hand. This included a well-lit apartment on the 4th floor, or the small stoves and pots. And you can see some of the small stoves and pots in this picture of a silk working atelier. They could use those to clean medical instruments and prepare remedies. It also gave them access to the networks across the city where they could acquire materials and distribute medicines. Silk work may even have given them the impetus to start medical work in the first place, given the occupational hazards of lung ailments caused by inhaling the dust from unraveling the cocoons, as well as the frequent burns from the hot water that they would have used to unravel the cocoons. So, by the 1780s, so jumping ahead a bit, Lyon was France's second city. It had a population of about 150,000, and they also were dominated by many powerful corporations. This included the Silk Workers Guild and the medical corporations. Of the medical corporations, the surgeons were one of the most powerful. The corporate medical bodies didn't generally have a problem with non-corporate medical activities. In other words, things going beyond what the surgeons were doing in their own. Indeed, Grandin Fiançon's apartment was quite near the surgeon's company in town, and the surgeon's network of informants would have reported on any contraventions against the regulations quite regularly. So in other words, if they were doing anything, the surgeons would have known about it. It's not something that they were keeping secret. For many years, Grandin Fiançon developed a successful medical practice, literally almost under the surgeons' noses. Now, many other non-corporate medical practitioners also operated in plain sight between 1750 and 1770. For example, the Affiche de Lyon, which is a kind of newspaper, showed that many people advertised a range of medicines, which ranged from having single remedies to hands-on caregiving, either in their own home or in somebody else's home. And at least 59 of those were women. So in other words, there were a lot of women offering medical services, and it was not uncommon. And this is important because there was an arrêté that was passed in January of 1759 that forbade women from incorporating on any aspect of surgery except midwifery. But women continued to advertise widely. So in other words, you've got the law and you've got the reality, and the two don't necessarily meet. Now, the edict was also an excuse for the surgeons, however, to crack down on a small group of medical practitioners, despite the fact that they'd known this was all going on for a long time. And this included cracking down on Grandin Fiançon. Between the 24th to the 28th of March in 1759, they went after about 7 different practitioners in town, 7 out of all of those many others that they could have. In response, Grandin Fiançon argued that charity was central to their medical practice. They'd largely been serving the poor without charge. Now, this was a common defense strategy, but it was also true, as we heard from Finn's talk earlier, that women did often provide charitable care. Although we tended to associate that with the elite, it was also happening within an urban context as well. Grand also expressed a distinct occupational identity, describing herself as that herbalist and chemist, which, interestingly enough, the chemist was a term only associated with men advertising in the affiche. So for her to be claiming that was quite a bold statement of her abilities and her knowledge. So a herbalist was somebody who gathered, knew, and used plants, while a chemist was somebody who prepared medicines. They distilled waters, they made pills. So in other words, a lot of those hands-on activities. Now, typically, healers who operated charitably remained unchallenged, as these women had done for decades. One of their patients later says that they'd been doing this for 30 years, and only now had the surgeons bothered to come see them. At this time, however, what the surgeons were cracking down on with these women was the treatment of 3 illnesses that they decided were the purview of surgeons: epilepsy, again, ringworm, and hydropsy. Now, we would argue that this was because of their observable success. And indeed, the others involved in the crackdown were also very successful practitioners. In other words, the surgeons were seeing them as hot competition. So what did their practice actually look like? So from the surgical crackdown, we have a detailed inventory list of what the surgeons found when they investigated the women's residence. And actually, they took it all away as well. We have the inventories for the others prosecuted as well. Now, the paperwork that was kept by the women themselves consisted of printed handbills, clumsily written lists of herbs, ingredients, all of this on scraps of paper. There were 46 testimonials from patients, correspondence with 15 rural clients, including a convent, and recipe exchanges with a Capuchin priest who lived outside of Lyon. They also had receipts for taking in patients, payments to a woman outside Lyon who'd been gathering plants and herbs for them. They brokered between the city's hospitals and rural wet nurses. They had credit notes for loans. They had requests for patients to pay. And they also had 2 cheaply bound notebooks with recipes and herbal descriptions. And on here we have one that is talking about the properties of sage, bugloss, and betony. So in other words, they had a lot of papers themselves, which is another aspect. It's not just about the inventory. Their wide-ranging papers suggest that they had a very wide geographical and socioeconomic reach. In other words, this was a wide-ranging community that they were treating. And the scope of their practice was also incredibly wide. They were doing virtually everything, right? So I want to turn now to thinking about some of the things they were doing. The women occasionally provided something that historians are calling body work, which is used to describe hands-on care, and that could range from massages to nursing to application of various remedies. So it could vary. In this case, the body work that they were providing included hands-on care within their own home. So what we can see with their case is that they were really blurring the boundary between domestic and paid medicine, that residence is a place where they were looking after patients in their domestic but also professional sphere. For example, in November 1752, Grand accepted a 3-year-old into her home to treat ringworm for a period of 9 months and 9 days. The care agreement included a monthly sum for food and the payment of 1 servant, since the child was not toilet trained. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems like a lot of work. And in fact, providing daily care for a young child, it's even when they're healthy, it's labor-intensive and time-consuming. But this child with ringworm would have required frequent applications of ointments several times a day, as well as the regular administration of purges, which is commonly done for the treatment of ringworm, or was done. So purges can be a messy business. I mean, you think that you take the purge and it's just 1 in, 1 out, but actually it often is described as something being very urgent. So imagine that with a 3-year-old in your own house. So body work could be pretty intense. But they also had a lot of medical recipes, and I want to emphasize that their medical recipes were herbal in nature, and they were very legitimate medicine. These are the sorts of remedies you would find in physicians' and surgeons' books as well. So they're not doing anything on the fringe. This is all perfectly ordinary. One booklet that they had included descriptions and properties of herbs, which we already looked at, as well as remedies such as this one. This is a treatment for impetigo, and it had a number of herbs in it, such as fumaria water and psyllium seeds, And then it had some really good things for a purge, manna and vegetal salt, which were often used in purges. They really liked purging in that period. They did have some non-herbal components in other recipes, which ranged from gums, waxes, pig dung. I know some of you were hearing the talk at the one table about the use of dung in medicine, so pig dung was used as well, mercury and Venice turpentine. But again, all of these were standard medicine. There's nothing weird, nothing out of the ordinary with these. For example, and just to give you some idea of the overlap between learned medicine and what was in their collection, they had things like an unguent of chamomile with rue leaves, linseed, and soap, so a nice sort of lotion for you. They had bouillons to stop vomiting, other ones to purify the blood, so it's not even untasty if you've got a decent bouillon. They had an eye water, medicines for headaches. They had loose recipes. I say loose because outside of the book they had just little pieces of paper on which they had balms, cataplasms, liniments, tisanes, pills, and sudorifics, which treated many ailments, including hydropsy and venereal disease. Again, things in the purview of the surgeons, which I think was part of the problem. Now, there were a couple hints of religious or magical healing, but these were very few and far between. The two that I found, one was a certificate of authenticity from 1738 for a relic that could be used for healing, as well as a baby boy's caul, which was labeled and wrapped in a sheet of paper for careful preservation. And there were little tiny cuts out of it that suggest that they were being put into things like amulets or used in remedies. But herbal remedies predominated. There was nothing to suggest that this was a surgical practice more than a domestic one. This is stuff that's probably very familiar to your elite women as well, isn't it? Anyways, when the surgeons investigated Grand and Fiançon's home on the 26th of March in 1759, they searched the women's home and seized their medical equipment and a lot more. And I've put this picture up even though it's from the 16th century, just because it gives you a sense of the size of some of the medical equipment, but also it shows you the process of working with the herbs, distilling them, and then you've got the remedies ready for use on the side there. The inventory tells us the women stored various remedies and ingredients. There were 37 pots of balms and unguents for wounds and ulcers, 9 boxes of medicinal powders, including one of savin, which was used to induce abortions and menstrual periods, and it was also prohibited by law. They had 11 pots of unguent, 80 packages of different remedies, ranging from powders, unguents, and plastered, a packet of rolled plasters, 18 vials of waters and composite liqueurs, which makes me think of this side here, and a glass bottle of saltpeter. So a lot, right? That's a lot to have on hand, especially considering that they're on a 4th floor apartment. The women also had substantial equipment to prepare, distill, and deliver their own medicines. They had several mortars and pestles, including, let's be precise, 1 copper, a drum sieve for distillation, several components for alembic stills in both copper and glass, and syringes for treating women's ailments. They even had 5 books. 4 of them were remedy collections and 1 on childbirth. This is pretty extensive. Now, if you compare this to the others who also had their inventories seized by the Surgical Corporation, you'll see it's quite substantial. Some of those pretty much had small-scale equipment and some remedies, while another had extensive distillation equipment and 3 books, but they didn't have any remedies with it. The only other woman targeted in the raid, Antoinette Martin, primarily treated venereal disease, which was the problem. The most successful practice was that of the botanist Sarin, who had 26 surgical or recipe books that were bound in sheepskin or vellum, very fancy, 2 syringes, a tablet with the names and addresses of patients, small amounts of medicine, so nothing on the scale that Grand and Fiançon had. So within this context, Grand and Fiançon had an impressive setup of books, equipment, and ingredients to make medicines for a wide range of conditions, as well as items ready for sale to their patients. After the surgeon's raid, Grand and Fiançon activated their support network from all around Lyon as well as the environs. And they wanted to minimize, obviously, the damage to their livelihood. Now, this was very quick. It was within 2 days of the seizure of their equipment by the surgeons. Their collected paperwork seems to have been created as part of this defense strategy. The women immediately challenged the surgeons, and they stated that many of the respectable townspeople came to them after the raid to testify about their charitable healing. The letter that they sent, the courts begged not to have a fine imposed, which was 500 livres, which is quite substantial, as this would reduce them to begging, especially given that they did mostly charitable work. 24 of the 46 patient testimonials were in the form of a legal brief, so definitely intended for the judges. They were probably included with the letter to the consulate. The women mobilized that support within a matter of days, which tells you how firmly embedded in the community they were. Now, there were key strategies in play. The testimonials only named Grande, although there was a lot of evidence that both women were practicing healing. This could be a hierarchy of age or working practice. Grande also emphasized that her work was with herbs, only herbs, and a science that God gave her. So, claiming again that mantle of charity and downplaying the accusations about practicing surgery, which was a crucial point to make. Patients also emphasized that they only turned to Grande after the surgeons had abandoned them. And this, again, is a common narrative strategy, but it emphasizes that she's doing something that the surgeons couldn't do. So it highlighted her important charitable work and activities, and these were all acceptable ways for women to be involved with medicine. There were also, at this point, some extrajudicial negotiations with the surgical corporation, perhaps because of that immediate mobilization of such a large chunk of the community. Grande still had to pay a fine, but it was significantly reduced. It was a much smaller amount, and the surgeons, sadly, kept most of her equipment. Now, they were still disappointed by the outcome. So a year later, the women turned to their wealthier clientele for help. They wanted to obtain a patent to practice medicine without interference from the surgical corporation because they knew that this was a potentially risky activity still. This time they wanted to approach the king's first physician who dealt with such requests and who sat on the Royal Medical Commission, which was a group of physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries. In April of 1760, they had one of their local friends ask a friend in Paris, Madame Parens, who would ask her husband to contact the physician who could authorize Grande to work with her simple remedies. So in other words, they're using these networks largely through women and women's family to get heard at the center of power in the land. Around the same time, Grande and Fiançon also pled with their patron, Madame de Groslay, and they asked her if they could have help in obtaining a royal patent to treat the sick poor. So again, claiming a very distinct area. Unfortunately, the Royal Commission's response in September was unfavorable. A brevet was only reserved for those who had particular secrets, one remedy, for example, not for those who, like Grande, was practicing la grande médecine that used plants and did a lot more. They did note, however, that such work had nothing to do with the surgeons in the royal court, although I think that was of small comfort. Royal protection was not forthcoming, but it is significant that their networks were so powerful that it did actually reach the center of power for their request to be heard, at least. Now, Grande and Fiançon's reliance on plants and herbs in their healing practices, I think you can see that they straddled the boundaries between surgeons, physicians, and apothecaries, especially given the fact that she was calling herself a chemist. This was part of the problem. The practice was so extensive with broad-ranging skills and knowledge that it couldn't be protected using the existing mechanism that would allow women to license their proprietary medicine or specifics. At this point, Grande and Fiançon disappear from the records, though given their networks, they presumably continued to practice medicine, if on sufferance from the surgeons and at a bit of a financial loss. Their story, however, spanned the silk-working industry and medical world in one apartment, and I think it challenges the ways in which women's medical practices have been made invisible by binary assumptions about does it have to be domestic or does it have to be paid, as well as through corporate record keeping. These two women who practiced la grande médecine were at the center of everyday urban medical practice. They weren't on the fringe. They had solid and effective networks, and they knew a lot, and they had a very extensive practice. Their story also reveals the coexistence of paid, charitable, and domestic medicine as part of women's everyday practices. Their domestic space and multi-purpose equipment also meant that they could undertake that range of medical work, as well as the silk work that they started with. Their space also meant that they could take in and care for chronic and convalescing patients, as well as use it as a place to meet or correspond with patients. But what makes their story so interesting is that it's only by chance that Grande and Fiançon, with their medical practice and networks, ever became visible at all, because this is rare for women's practices to be so visible. They weren't extraordinary in terms of their practice. They were extraordinarily because their materials survived. Thank you. Do we have time for a question? Okay, we have time for a question.
Oh, thank you. Loved the talk. I was thinking a lot about when you were talking about kind of analogous situations in London and England, and I'm aware that I'm saying this in the RCP and surrounded by the lovely RCP staff members. But when the RCP was founded, it was founded for multiple reasons, one of which was to advance science, the other one was to kind of crack down on the same kind of things you're talking about and move to license medicine. And I worked a little bit on Mary Try, who was also a chemist in Pall Mall, so she wasn't short of any money, let's put it that way. So she was very successful. And I was just, I mean, you summed it up in the final bit of your talk about how these women are so extraordinary, not because of what they do, but because we still have it. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the collection side and how these things have been captured through persecution is a strong word, but I will use it anyway, through the persecution from the surgeons.
So I think that's an important part of their story, actually. And it's interesting that the records did not end up where the surgical records would normally be kept. They ended up in the Archives Departemental rather than the municipal archives, which suggests a potential misfiling, right? Or was it because they were collected by the women for a particular purpose that came after the surgeons' crackdown? So on the one hand, we know quite a bit about what they had in their possession because of the inventory, but the rest was things that they had collected to advance their case that they should have protection from the surgeons. So I think it's also a unique one insofar as it's not coming through the surgeons, it's coming through their own collection. That said, you know, it only became visible as well that it had anything to do with medicine because an archivist at some point had written down that this was an apothecary. Although, again, there's places where that elides what was the full truth because they weren't apothecaries. And also, it only made reference to Grande, even though Fiançon played a critical part in the paperwork as well. So even there, the archiving practice, it's accidental, but also not necessarily precise to describe what's in it. So I think one of the things we were trying to get away from was centering the medical corporations, because that tends to be the ways in which we've talked about finding these women. And so that then predisposes you to seeing them on the fringe of medical care, because if you've got the people at the center who are setting out the rules, are describing them as, well, they don't really know what they're doing, do they? And that's why we need to crack down on them. And it pushes them to the periphery. But they weren't at the periphery. They were there at the center of Lyon doing everything. And that's why the surgeons got annoyed. So I think there really is that tension there, that it's, you know, on the one hand, the corporations are there trying to crack down, but it's also so problematic, isn't it? Anyways, thank you. That's a great question. Right. Shall we? Yeah?
That's okay, thank you. Just to go off that, I have done some research where it's the same thing happened in London, where crackdowns on specifically women and the formerly enslaved who were practicing surgery here.
Yeah.
But my question is more, did you find any particular diseases or incurables that these women were working with that the surgeons couldn't cure, for instance, like cancer in your research?
It wasn't so much cancer. They tended to treat the usual sorts of things, right? It's a broad range of things. And so, you know, some of the patients are claiming that they were abandoned, but you could be abandoned for just skin conditions as well, that we can't do anything about that. So it's a tricky thing. I'd have to go back and try to pin down because we're still working on the project, and try to pin down if there's any correlation, because that's a really good question. But I don't know.
Yeah, so really they were central because it was everyday ailments. It wasn't just like the surgeon forced me to go to you kind of thing.
No, and I think that's the other important thing, is that what they were doing wasn't actually surgery. It is largely herbal medicine, right? So it's the surgeons claim it's their problem, but it isn't really. It's just that they were successful and having some success with things that did fall into the surgical purview. Thanks. That's a good question. Thank you.